Morning, everybody. And it is a real pleasure to be here this morning, not least because I always enjoy coming back to Australia and becoming a more and more frequent visitor, which is great, but also because I started much of my working life in and with PwC. So it's kind of really nice to be back in PwC and to recognise actually a lot of my thinking on this subject has been formed and was part of that experience as training to be a chartered accountant. Have we got any others in the room at the moment? Any other accountants? Come on, put your hands up. That's a lot, actually. You'd be amazed the number of times you do that and no one tells you or is willing to wave their hand in the air. So I've just come from Perth, and you wouldn't know it from being there, but apparently we're in the midst of a global financial crisis. It's been one of the few parts of the world which is booming. But we are, and we all face significant and huge challenges, and they seem to be growing rather than ebbing at the moment. And I think it's fair to say that more and more people are recognising the importance of these issues, of social and environmental risks and opportunities as well that we face as a society, and the need to address them. Michael Porter has just brought out another book on shared value, talking about a new way in which business must think about value creation. Professor Tim Jackson has another of the books in the stream of prosperity and wealth, outlining the challenges that we face as a planet and the limits to growth that are upon us shortly. There are some practical solutions that are going on to all that. We mentioned already the integrated reporting standard as one route into that, and I was astounded, I suppose, to see recently in the tax discussions that have been going on here, but also internationally, the idea that the very rich are putting their hands up and saying we should pay more tax, recognising perhaps, even though that may not come to pass, that inequality is a significant driver of many of the problems that we face. And in Western Australia, where was the government, there have just issued the snappily named Delivering Community Services in Partnership Policy. That's the one. But again, importantly recognising that public sector needs to start commissioning outcomes more effectively, commissioning change, and not doing business as we had done. And so, you know, there's a sea change of thinking and recognition that these issues, which partly bring us all together today, are things that we really do need to sort out as a society and in our businesses and our daily lives. Our bit of that journey has been, if this would only work, yes, has been the development of the Social Return on Investment Network, which started from work that was done in the States with an organisation called the Roberts Enterprise Development Fund, some years ago with a guy called Jed Emerson, who is the kind of founding father of all this. And we've had a journey to come to what is now an international network. The first step, I suppose, from that initial thinking was I spent some time working more closely than I do now with the New Economics Foundation. But also I think I was at the time chair of an organisation called Accountability, which has also had a strong history here. And I think contribution to this has been perhaps under-recognised. The big steps that we took to recognising that value comes in different forms and is experienced in different ways by different people. The question of materiality, which whilst will be water off a duck's back to the accountants here, may seem a little strange language, but is really fundamental to a question about how we make some of these decisions. And an ongoing recognition, actually, that this is a conversation about value. That language that we will have values, we have business values, we try to generate value. Actually, I think, although we sometimes talk about impact, at the heart of this we're saying, well, what's the value of all this? And it's not for nothing, therefore, that our strapline is accounting for value. And I sometimes wonder when we come to the point we should switch that round and say, we're about accounting for value, and maybe we use this methodology called social return. So that's 10 or so years. You know, we're small, 700 members. You know, when we set our targets, I think we were down at 200, so we're way above that, which is great. But nonetheless, this is still very small in 26 countries, which, you know, includes outliers. We have a new member in Paraguay recently. I have no idea why someone in Paraguay decided they should join, but they haven't. I now need to find a reason urgently to go and visit our member in Paraguay and look after them. There are over 50 members here. The strength of the interest in this field here is really high. There's 400 plus on an email list at the moment, something like that. We have a big chunk of people who we've supported through accreditation. In Perth, there were many meetings with individuals thinking about this. The public and government sectors were saying we're really interested in this. Increasingly big businesses are coming saying we need to recognise this. We're not involved with this, but I just saw the other day that Pepsi are using social return as part of thinking about their supply chain. These are not just CSR issues, these are ways of relating perhaps what sometimes have been seen as that part of shared value back to the business case, and is a practical way of getting us to start thinking about that. And we've always said, that we, maybe slightly contentiously at times, that we need to have a bar in this. It's no good to go, everything's great. Whatever you do, all these evaluations where, it's always good in the sun. But actually we have an assurance process. It's formative, it's learning, it's perhaps at a low level, although those going through it would perhaps deny that. But we recognise that we need some kind of level of consistency, and that we need to have some bar in that, and we need to learn about that together. And so we have 40 or so people who've gone through that process as we try and reach out to develop an international standard. And by standard, we don't mean kind of one way, we mean standardising how we think about these issues, which will grow over time. It's not going to be immediate. But that international network provides us with a home to have those conversations and a place to grow, whilst at the same time we try and encourage national networks. And there are some forms, in the Netherlands, for example. There are some developing in Canada, the US, Japan, and there is, this is the one country where I've kind of been thinking for a while, why isn't it there yet? And it's so good to see today, because there's so much more interest and so much more experience in many other places. And the skills now, Kevin's going to be telling us about the practical experience of some of that, so it's lost, but there's a huge body now of expertise in this area, which allows those national networks to develop. We've seen, this last year, the guide that we originally produced with the support of the Cabinet Office in the UK, which was very helpful, but that has now been translated into Korean and Chinese and French, and I'm promised into Japanese by the end of the year. So this is obviously tuning to international interest in many cultures and contexts as well. That gets us to where we are now, a little bit faster perhaps than we'd have thought, but nonetheless a lot slower than perhaps we should be aspiring to, really. We should have another 3 zeros across that membership. If you're going to balance the level of interest and time and energy as a society we spend on financial value with the level of interest and time and energy we should be spending on that other value, this broader sense of value, and it seems to me perfectly sensible that we should, then we should be really scaling those numbers up. So I wanted to just kind of think about partly where we're going, why we want to go there, and partly what our thinking has been in how we approach this question by thinking about accounting for a second. So I want you to imagine, if you can, a world in which there isn't one way of doing accounting. You can do it any way you want. It's a bit of an intake there, Matt. What? Shock. Horrible. So just think about that for a second. You turn up to list your new business on the stock exchange, and the stock exchange people go, well, you can tell us what your financial forecasts are using any odd methodology. We wouldn't think it would be appropriate to tell you one way of doing that. That would surely be wrong. So you go and give us your forecasts how you wish. And you go along to your bank manager and you say, I'd like to borrow some money for this new venture. And they say, well, have you got any forecasts? Well, kind of. I've kind of doing it in a different way to the ones you may have seen. Is that okay? And they go, yeah, that's fine, don't worry. I'm sure we can lend you the money. And at your board meeting, which you're going to have shortly, when you come to the end of the year and your directors say to you, how did we do? Did we make a profit this year? And you go, well, we don't really measure it that way, We're still thinking about what ways we might look at it and see which are most appropriate for our business. But at the moment, we can't really tell you. But we can tell you, we had a lot of money come in and we spent a lot of money going out, so we think we did a pretty good job. Is that okay? And they go, yeah, that's fine. I can't imagine, well, I can imagine, and I suspect you can imagine, what would happen in a world that had a multiplicity and confusion of ways of accounting for financial value. I suspect investment wouldn't go up, that it would go down, and the GFC would look like a bit of a tea party compared to the level of uncertainty that would introduce into markets. Now, fortunately, we don't have that. Fortunately, we have one approach to accounting, generally accepted accounting principles, which are global, ubiquitous, but they're not exactly the same. And they are based, most importantly, on judgments. And for those of you who are accountants, this will be no news, but for those of you who are not, it may be, that when you come to the annual accounts of the big corporates at the end of the year, and they come out with their profit figures, which can be as high as 20 billion, that number that sits there in the accounts is not an objective fact. It could have been different numbers. In fact, there's a range within which that profit could have been reported, which would have been perfectly acceptable to the auditors and to the markets. Strangely, they're presented as one number for us, but actually more appropriately might be to show them as a range. There are significant judgments that go in to the creation of a set of financial accounts. And the more complex the organisation, the more judgment is required in finalising those figures. Even in our small organisation, I'm perfectly aware that I've got a bit of wriggle room. You know, I can go, well, too much profit, more tax, too little profit, my board will want a new chief executive, somewhere in between the two, but I've got a little bit of play. And in large organisations, you've got a lot more play. And that's because what's happening is that accounting is based on a set of principles which are applied using judgments, and you have to make judgments. And over the last however many 100 years that we've had of accounting, the range within which those judgments have been made is becoming quite narrow. There's a kind of, you know, you can go, there's a bit of play, but not that much anymore. We're tightening that up. And in some areas, like derivatives, for example, I suspect there's still more room for judgment. But in other areas, it's much tighter. That's taken time. And we're in a different place. We're saying, yes, we do need principles. We do need an approach which has room for manoeuvre in it. But we're at the moment not 400 years into accounting, we're 20 or so. This is a growing and a learning process. And our range of judgment that we can kind of see at the moment is inevitably much broader, in which we'd go, that's fine. Of course we'd like to tighten that up, because tightening up allows us to communicate more effectively. And people often will talk about social return investment because it does what it says on the tin. It will give you a return on investment if you so wish it, about that ratio, and about how you can compare it. And those of you who know that that question means you need to know what are you going to compare it for and who you're going to compare it with, is slightly more subtle than that, will recognise that that's not a great question by itself. But we certainly would find that by itself hard to compare when we've got this wide range, when there's so many options in there at the moment. You can compare the thinking. And standardising and getting some consistency in how we have come to answer the questions of, effectively, how much difference did we make? How much value have we actually created? Is going to be, I think, the way forward in what is otherwise seemingly sometimes a confusing space. And this might be a bit of a surprise to you, but since I've certainly I escaped it. But more and more I think about this, the more I realise that the audit process is absolutely fundamental. You know, that accounting set of principles, we made them up. They were not brought to us on tablets of stone from on high, and they weren't discovered by an eminent scientist thinking, oh, that's gravity. We made them up. We made them up because they're useful in order for us to tell stories to each other about the financial value we've created. And their usefulness is built up over years, but they're a social construct. And that means, absolutely fundamentally, that if you're going to tell a story about how much value you've created, and I mean financial value, you have to have someone come in and say, well, is that okay? Is that reasonable? That process of reducing the range by which we account for financial value happened because of a tension between the organisations telling one story about how they've used those principles and the audit function coming in and saying no or yes. And at the margins, that has stopped businesses existing, not because they have no money, but because they hadn't shown adequate understanding of the principles and been able to turn a profit. And I've sat on the side of that conversation where we've said to business, no, your judgments about those principles are not acceptable, we're not accepting them, you have made a loss this year, and the shares will cease trading. And that's an extraordinary reality, that means that at the margins, the investment flows in the world that we live in and everything around us is being informed by a set of principles that we made up, influenced by an audit process, which has tested them in reality. I find that quite strange and also powerful. But it emphasises to me the importance of that dynamic. And that is why I think in the social value conversation as well, we need to have that tension. We need a bottom-up conversation. There's no answer to this. No one's going to come along tomorrow and say, there it is for you. This is going to have to emerge from conversations. And that's the fundamental reason why we have a network and why we have a space in which people can come together and debate from their practice what good enough judgments look like as they apply that set of principles. I still remain, I mean, it's a bit of an outlier perhaps at times, but there's so much of the time you will hear people saying, well, we can't pick one approach to this, or we shouldn't expect organisations to have only one way of doing this. We must allow people to have many ways of thinking about social value. I remember when we didn't say that about financial value because we recognised the chaos that would ensue. I think we do need to get a little bit off the fence on this and stop saying, isn't it fantastic there are 240 ways of accounting for social value, and say, no, it is not great. Actually, as a society, we need to start to coalesce, to converge. And that's another reason to have a network in which we can start to have debates about what convergence looks like, which is partly about judgments. Actually, I'm quite optimistic. If I think about the integrated reporting standards, think about accountability's work, GRI, our work, you know, there is a growing convergence around what these principles will look like. We are moving in the right direction. And actually, those stories about, isn't it amazing there's so many ways, actually don't tell the whole truth. You know, there's much more consistency happening now. But I do think we need to be much more willing to say, no, that's not good enough. We need to know not whether we have done good things, we need to know how much value we have created. And we need to recognise that sometimes we do not create any value, and that maybe some of those activities should cease. Imagine the business that can go on reporting a profit even when it hasn't, because there is an absence of that pushback. One of the early jobs I did overseas in Tanzania was with the Rural Development Bank, which had been posting profits for years and years and years, despite the fact it had absolutely no money, simply by accruing interest on its loan portfolio. Fantastic. But it was producing accounts which showed a profit because of the absence of that audit. Now, it is possible, unfortunately, for organisations who say they create lots of social value to continue to exist even when perhaps they don't, or at least don't create anything like as much. And I feel that we need to move beyond that and have some of those hard debates in order that we can get enough consistency that we can have the same level of understanding and communication and investment flow effectively into activities which generate substantively more social value than we have done in the past. And so that's what social return on investment does. It's not a tool in a sense, therefore, it's a set of principles which have to be applied in a framework, requiring judgments. We're interested in value of material changes in experience. That's pretty much like accounting, actually. The accountants around us. Set of principles in a framework requiring judgments. This is a broader sense of value. It's not all value, it's a broader sense of value. And it's one that we are challenged by, and we're at the beginning of, but one I think that is certainly soluble, given enough will and interest, and of course time and energy, as people, many of you here were all thinking about these issues, coming from Perth with a bunch of people, sitting down thinking about these issues. The week before I was in Tokyo, people thinking about these issues. There is much more appetite and willingness to deal with these questions now. But if we don't do that, we're going to be in this situation. Which is all too common in the social value space. I'll just leave you with a thought. About 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, no less, there were about 20 approaches for weights and measures. So let alone kilos and pounds, there were 20 odd ways of frameworks, if you want, for weights of how much things weighed. And everybody, of course, thought their way was the best way, and they were going to hang on in there and hang on to theirs, and we needed to keep that going, and it went on, until such time as the king decided to knock a few heads together and say, well, we just have one approach, please, thank you very much. And so it was, there was one approach. And sometimes it's enough to make you wish you were a royalist. Thank you very much.
We still have two approaches.
Thank you.